15 years since I stood in this pulpit. Amazing. I want to thank Wendy and Chad for the wonderful prelude. Let's thank them again. You know it's a complicated change when the deacon starts to recommend songs for you. Kate Wolf's Give Yourself to Love. When I was in college in the late 60s, yes, I'm that old, in the Bay Area, Kate was a frequent performer at local coffee houses and pubs. I heard her several times at the renowned Katati Inn. This song, I believe, speaks directly to our way of love practice. If you do not know the song, or Kate, I hope you can add it to your library. When Bishop Prior, Ryan, chose the song for our recent convention and for a blog of his, I called him and we shared our appreciation of her work. He sent me an emoji back with a pair of sunglasses on. As I suspect Kate knew very well, if it isn't about love, it's not about God. In the gospel today, we hear, were our hearts not burning within us as the disciples began to share their experience with the risen Christ with them on the road that day. Imagine for a moment times in your life when, as the Celtic would say, you experienced a thin place, and the recognition of the holy in some indescribable way was overwhelming for you, rushing over you like a wind, or sending chills up your spine. It might have been listening to a piece of music, as we did earlier, taking a hike in the wilderness, as John Muir often described. And when he wrote, "At the touch of this divine light, the mountains seemed to kindle to a rapt religious consciousness and stood hushed, like devout worshipers waiting to be blessed." Or, in our regular worship together, a moment perhaps where you were overwhelmed by grace or intuition or memory. Several years ago, several of us, some from St. John's, were invited to a gathering of the Justice and Peace Commission of the Episcopal Church at a meeting in Wayzata at the Cenacle, which I believe is now gone. There were Episcopalians from all over North, South, and Central America, and we prayed, and we discussed, and we told stories, and we planned for what we would do to create a culture of peace. Before lunch, we shared Eucharist. And Steve Charleston, a priest, member of the Choctaw Nation, then the vicar of Holy Trinity St. Ansgar in the West Bank, celebrated. Now Steve, as most of you know, shortly after that was elected to be the Bishop of Alaska, where he served for many years, and then became the Dean of Episcopal Divinity School, and is currently semi-retired, or whatever that means for retired bishops. Now Steve asked us to put down our Book of Common Prayer and gathered us together around the altar and hold hands, and he retold the story of the Last Supper in the upper room. In a slow, intentional manner, he was able to move me, and I suspect everyone in that room, to a time over 2,000 years in the past, as if we were there, present with Jesus, as he walked toward his certain murder. Now, I am certain that Steve violated every rubric in the Book of Common Prayer and missed most of the key required words, Heidi. However, that Eucharist was for me the most significant in my life thus far. I was moved in time to be present at that table, along with everyone else I suspect in that room. And every time I see Steve, we will speak briefly of that day and that moment. So again, I ask you, imagine for a moment holy experiences in your life that you will never forget. One of the important powers of ritual practice or worship is to recreate mythic time and space as sacred, as something basically and totally different than our profane, normal world. Mircea Eliade, philosopher and theologian, wrote that all rituals at their core are reenactments of the primordial deeds performed by God or other mythical ancestors during the period of creation. And in imitating these original events as if they were happening once more, we release some of the potent transformative power that clearly was present at the very beginning of the world. Through ritual and through worship, we are able to recreate the world, to re-sacralize time and to begin anew, each ritual restoring freshness and strength to a broken world. The Abrahamic religions have a more historical, linear view, perhaps, of time than some other faith traditions. When a Christian participates in the Eucharist, or a Jew in the Seder, or Passover, or a Muslim during Hajj, we are reliving the original Last Supper, or the Exodus, or the stories of one of the 5 pillars of Islam. It is an experience of ritual remembering that connects the community of faith not only to that original story, the original actors, but to all of those who have performed the same ritual throughout the ages, including in present time and on this day. Our worship integrates past and present, providing us with a sense of connectedness. We might say that profane time is subordinated and a sacred eternal time emerges for us. Thomas Merton wrote in his memoirs of a time before he took his final vows. He was traveling in Cuba with friends, discerning if the monastic life was God's call to him. As he walked along early one Sunday morning, he heard the bells of a local church that was attached to an orphanage and to a school, and he stepped into worship, kneeling to pray. He wrote the following of that experience. Before any head was raised, the clear cry of the brother in the brown robe cut through the silence with the words, "Yo credo, I believe," which immediately all the children took up after him with such loud and strong and clear voices, and such unanimity and such meaning and fervor, that something went off inside me like a thunderclap. And without seeing or apprehending anything through any of my senses, I knew with the most absolute and unquestionable certainty that before me, between me and the altar, was the same God in all God's essence. God surrounded by the radiant faces of the thousands, the millions, the uncountable number of saints, contemplating God's glory and praising his holy name. The unshakable certainty, the clear and immediate knowledge that heaven was right in front of me, struck like a thunderbolt, and went through me like a flash of lightning and seemed to lift me clean up off the earth. Imagine those times in your life. So listen again to the words of Kate Wolf. What brings each of us to this place today? What brings us together here has blessed each and every one of us. That love has made a circle that holds each of us inside, where strangers are as family and where loneliness cannot hide. The Isaiah message for today calls yet another level of understanding, one greater perhaps than worship or ritual itself, but to the path of justice and righteousness. And Isaiah writes, "Maintain justice and do what is right. Do not the foreigner joined to the community say that I will be separated. And do not let eunuch who keeps my Sabbath be removed. My house shall be called a house of prayer for all people. Now, this is strong language coming from Isaiah. It is not merely a mild, subtle suggestion about the complexion of the worshiping community, and clearly it is not a country club invitation to lunch. It is rather a clear call for us to recognize and to embrace the fullness of God's loving community. It is a call to resistance, as John Dominic Crossan writes, to resist the brutal normalcy of civilization. It is a notion of God that Guterres calls the God of life, a God who opposes oppression of all kinds, including the grinding down of the poor by unjust economic and political systems and the wreckage of habitats and life cycles of living species. And to the eunuch, who historically had been excluded from worship, we might understand this as all those who are not just like us. God promises full inclusion to the outsider, to the refugee, to the immigrant, clearly to women, to the GLBTQ community. More importantly, perhaps, than even family or sons or daughters. God, and later Jesus, invites those from the margins to the center of the covenant, to the center of Israel's cultural and worshiping communities. The way of Jesus asks each one of us, when was the last time that anything even close to the experiences of the early church has happened in the American church in our time? Consider the conditions, the historical reality of the people of the way in the times immediately following the resurrection. In historical fact, an underground hidden church. What if we place those conditions in our own time? Imagine if on your way to church you needed to check to see if you were being followed. Do we need to secretly hide our prayers to the people from the media? Do we indeed share a common purse? Do we preachers worry if our sermons or letters might show up on WikiLeaks? And do we worry perhaps that the Empire, or let's be specific, ICE, might break into our worship service to check the immigration status of our members? And what would we do? When we worship, and Michael, the presiding bishop, clearly states it should be weekly, I suggest there are 4 core elements of that experience. We have the opportunity in community to share and to remember our sacred stories in word and music and Eucharist. Secondly, together we recreate sacred space and sacred time in a very profane world. Thirdly, we actively co-create with God, the beloved community, the reign of heaven, justice and reconciliation. And finally, as both Anne Lalonde and Meister Eckhart centuries before have suggested, we pray, wow, thank you, and help me. As we practice and experience fully the 7 aspects of the way, turning and learning, praying and worship, blessing and going and resting, we will more abundantly recognize what it means to live fully into our baptismal promises, to unconditionally love one another, to more fully love God, and to follow the way of Jesus. As the presiding bishop writes, the Jesus movement is not a fanciful, if inspiring notion for the moment. It's not yet another program. It is not a quick fix for a long-term problem. It is a solemn call to return, to reclaim the deepest roots of who we are as followers of Jesus, and thereby to reorient ourselves in a time of profound disorientation. Amen.